You're listening to the StudioPTBO podcast, where we talk all things marketing to help you build and grow your business online. Welcome to the latest episode. Welcome to the StudioPTBO podcast. We are back, and we're back at it again with another great guest. I want to say thank you for tuning into the StudioPTBO podcast. It means the absolute world to us. We're really on a mission to help passionate and energetic entrepreneurs with marketing and mindset knowledge, help them build, grow, and scale their business online. Before we intro our guest, Neil, my man, how are you doing? How is life doing? How are you feeling? What's up?
I'm feeling great, Cody May. It's we're doing it on a little bit differently today on Zoom instead of StreamYard. It's such as the nature of technology and
I know, right?
in this era. But we sorted it out, and we are super stoked today to have Victoria Sakal on the podcast. And she is the managing director of brand intelligence with Morning Consult they're based out of New York, correct, Victoria?
Yeah, actually, DC. We have a good presence in New York, but Washington, DC is where the roots were planted.
Oh, cool. And tell us a little bit about the sort of macro. It's a global intelligence company that sort of feeds what is happening in real time, like real-time data for companies and brands to help them react. So tell us about what that looks like, going in the weeds a little bit more about what makes your company differently. And you're one of the emerging technology companies right now in North America, so congrats.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you to both of you for having me on today. I'm excited to get into all things brand. Lots going on, of course, this year, this month, this week. Never a dull moment. But Morning Consult, just as a little bit of background, began kind of in the roots of political polling and kind of, keeping tabs on how things are evolving among certain, whether it was, political parties. And, the background was in our prior election, really putting a tip of the spear on this idea that basically online versus phone voting can be a real differentiator, and that people will be a certain sort of transparent over the phone when they're talking to someone versus online. And that, led to this whole idea of the shy Trump voter, which we have continued to follow up on in this election. But since that political kind of basis, we've also evolved into actually our more kind of pillar product is around brand. So that's brand intelligence, the world I live in. And just this year, we've released econ intelligence. So the intersection of these three worlds, as you said, the combination of real-time data that's coming from thousands and thousands of consumers that we're speaking to on a daily basis around all things brand, how they're feeling about the economy, consumer confidence, and then even to the granularity of how they're thinking about the election or their local officials. All of these things, especially in 2020, have come to a real head, and the importance of real time and the dynamism of, the latest headline and how that's impacting your brand, or how, people will or will not be spending because of it, has become more important than ever.
I want to back up a bit because, I'm really always curious to know kind of like, how did you get here? Like, how did you get to this stage of, being the managing director of brand intelligence, like, which we're going to dive into. And I really want to kind of glean your insight and specifically, talking to entrepreneurs. But how did you get here? How did you get to Morning Consult? What's your journey been like up to this point?
Sure. My kind of two favorite worlds, thinking of, now there's an official term to be whole brain, but my two favorite worlds, even in high school, were this idea of strategy and, what do you do and how do you act, but also always data, to the point that I almost minored in math in school. But I ended up concentrating in a mix of marketing, and then it was operations management at the time, which is a lot about, the stats and the data around how you make business decisions. That led me to Kantar, which I was on the consulting team facing clients and working with them on a number of different business brand challenges. One of the things I loved about that was we focus on top line growth instead of a lot of consultancies will focus on how do you cut costs and become more efficient and kind of tinker with your roster of talent in order to hit your, quarterly targets of whatever. This idea of brand being a real, very high ceiling that you probably would never hit, but let's think about how we can grow in the upward fashion instead of cutting costs in the downward fashion, really kind of spoke to me. And through my years at Kantar, working with a number of different clients across categories, geographies, you name it, really became close to the news and what was going on and how that was affecting everything from brands strategies to consumer decisions to kind of the broader trends shaping our society. And then that ended up, leading to this role here at Morning Consult, where now leading the brand vertical and kind of the thought leadership in that capacity, it becomes, again, how should brands, function? And my first day actually on the job was the day that the U.S. shut down and everybody went into lockdown. So it became a very interesting remit to suddenly put my head in,
throw
the
you
minds
into
of
it.
business decision makers. Yeah, exactly. But the challenge and the opportunity is an exciting one, and that's how, again, should brands and businesses be thinking about navigating this time, which is changing, frankly, on a daily basis for consumers as much as it is for them.
Yeah, and you are again, like you said, you're coming into the company at a fascinating time, and the company itself is a real emerging startup, if you will, Morning Consult. Your founder was just recognized this week for top 40 under 40 in Ad Age, I think. Was it Ad Age?
That's right, Kyle Drop, absolutely.
Yeah, so what do you sort of attribute the company taking off this year in the pandemic to? Was it sort of switching gears? I mean, the political part has really, put you on the map, but as you said, you're pivoting more to working around branding and marketing for companies. So what's really enabled you guys? Is it PR, like, being on Marketing for the Now with Gary Vaynerchuk, which was amazing. You crushed it on that. But what do you attribute the company's emergence to right now?
It really was, the storm of people and brands and decision makers not knowing where to turn for insights and reality and kind of a foot on the ground, because frankly, the ground was really shaky and nobody really knew how to, take those first steps in March. And Morning Consult happening to be at this intersection of, yes, brand data and, the daily read. It kind of became like you check the markets in the morning, but you could also check your brand data and see if anything from just general sentiment towards your category was changing, or your advertisement that you had to pivot quickly, to accommodate this new reality, led you to step in it, or, was resonating with consumers. But then, layering on this econ component became really powerful because, as we know, across a number of different markets, but especially in the U.S., we were facing this reeling in of spending and understanding how people's consumer confidence was changing, but to the granularity of, yes, categories, but even MSAs. I mean, we know that this pandemic has hit on, different market levels on different capacities, but even down to zip codes and, what local legislation or regulations are around, where you can go and what you can do with your time. So having that real-time insight, but also the granularity became super powerful to our clients, our friends and kind of peers in this space who frankly just became, well, how can we help you? And that was, the exciting part of my challenge. It became, what are all the questions that these, business makers and decision makers were thinking of that I could just put something out there and hopefully help put some, numbers, if nothing else, around it.
So I'm really curious because, again, like you mentioned that you kind of came into this at a really, needless to say, interesting time. What are the three things that you've seen, from the beginning of the year to kind of when the pandemic hit? What are the three biggest consumer-centric shifts or changes that you've seen kind of in the marketplaces that have happened? Obviously, we see hospitality is probably one of the biggest things that biggest shifts that I would think that has really been hit. But what are three emerging changes that you've kind of seen at a high level overview? You don't have to necessarily get into specifics, but what are three things that you've seen kind of change in regards to consumer-centric buying or consumer-centric shifts and patterns in the marketplace?
I'll actually start more macro than that and say, the role of brands in consumers' lives has actually seen a definite evolution in the last couple of months. And we've seen that in both trust towards brands and even the leaders of those brands. Again, we're facing very real social, issues and upheaval here in the U.S., particularly, that really exacerbated this. But the role of brands in thinking about more than just profits, and thinking about more than getting things on shelves, but how do you take into consideration stakeholders and specifically your employees, and then take care of them? But this also translates to communications and advertising as well, where we saw, to almost a point of entertainment, where everybody was coming out with these empathetic and sentimental ads, and it became monotonous and, almost tedious to be able to turn your TV on but see the same things that are running through your head about this frustrating time. So we've seen the evolution where, consumers are increasingly looking for brands to, provide them information, show how they're taking care of consumers when they show up at their stores or at their restaurants and the precautions they're taking, but also provide some levity. Brands are selling things and consumers know that. And, the products or the partnerships or the creative ways that they're showing up in consumers' lives has definitely become more meaningful in a time where consumers just need something, as a break from their home and their, working at home and their kids at home and their daily routine. So that's kind of the first thing. And then secondly, thinking a little bit more granularly around consumption, we definitely saw this interesting trade-off between brands that people chose historically as their favorites and their, go-tos versus these new options. And part of that had to do with availability issues, which provided a real kind of gold moment for brands that happen to be on the shelves, of brands that happen to have a whole omni-channel digital e-commerce infrastructure set up and made it very easy to get into consumers' homes. But consumers also just became curious about trying something new or less stuck in their ways. And this is, this new bag of chips might actually be the most exciting thing of my day. So, but building on that, it became this, we're seeing over time, this is something we've actually tracked since right in the beginning, right in March. People are increasingly willing to stick with those new brands that they've tried, which kind of changes the dynamics of loyalty and exploration, and will be something we'll be closely watching as things start to resume normalcy and, kind of settle back down. Will people actually snap back to those brands that they chose before? Will they actually stick with the new ones, or will they just be more open in general? And then I think the last piece is around kind of building on that experiences and this idea of people discovering new hobbies at home and how they spend their time. So it's kind of the very long-winded third point here. We do see that people are, and I'm sure we've all experienced baking at home or, trying out new hobbies. What will stick and what, consumers will eventually forget about as they can leave their homes again remains to be seen for sure. But the fact that the adoption of these kind of craftier, more, maybe cathartic hobbies has risen very much possibly could be here to stay.
Yeah. What's interesting, you guys released a study and it shows Gen Z is sort of less attached to, the big brands than my generation, Gen X, baby boomers, which to me creates great opportunity for new emerging companies to be fun and innovative and creative on social media. What do you attribute Gen Z's lack of attachment to bigger, iconic brands right now? Is it just the fact that they're more engaged on social media, like TikTok culture, Instagram? They're more open to trying new things, being resistant or rebellious against their parents. What do you say in that regard?
There's two sides to that coin. The first is exactly as you said, that the exploration and the openness is definitely there, just because they're, new to a lot of different categories and are, buying what's on the shelves, and they're not, going to the trouble to find the given brand at the given, grocery store, whatever that might have it in stock. And then yes, digital, totally inundating them with new options based on probably pretty relevant needs or interests, et cetera. But the other side to that coin is actually we see that Gen Z is particularly influenced by what their parents like or use or have recommended to them. So that's, it's interesting from a kind of discovery component as well, that if you're living at home with your parents or mom knows that you like to eat a certain way and she's recommending a certain type of food, that becomes almost part of the funnel for this generation.
It's really interesting to kind of see the I guess the cross correlation between like what different audiences will attach onto. And I'm just really curious because like we work with a lot of entrepreneurs that, they're more focused on direct sales than they are about brand. So like, I'm really curious to know kind of your thoughts behind, how you look at like when you're working with larger corporations, obviously, and we have a few national corps that we work with as well. And even communicating the differences between the direct sales and the long-term branding. I guess like, what insight would you provide like an entrepreneur that is really looking at, experiencing direct related sales to marketing, I guess you could say, over long-term branding, and how how do you cross the chasm or cross the bridge between sales and branding and in that world?
That balance is increasingly, it was interesting even before the pandemic, and it's an increasingly precarious but interesting one now. To your point, exactly, the branding piece actually can't go away. So it's, of course, these companies have to survive and, ultimately basically pay their bills through the direct sales that they're achieving through performance marketing. But the branding component is what keeps you even on the radar for consumers, so that whether it's now or whether, when they can step out of their houses more freely, they think of you as an option, and as ideally an option that was either present for them or provided some sort of entertainment or service, or was thinking of them in some way during this tough time, whether economically, whether because of the pandemic or otherwise. But the performance side of things, and this relates to some of what we were just talking about with the funnel changing, it's of course relevant as well, because now you're seeing all of these companies, big and small, really rushing online and scrambling to get their act together and make sure that it's connected between whatever their offline, physical presence was as well. We saw D2C starting to move from solely online to physical presence even before the pandemic. And now, at least they have the infrastructure to have been available digitally and all fully set up. But now big brands are also coming into this space, and some of them doing it pretty well. We think of Walmart, who was able to, deliver. They're getting very, much attention and kind of celebration for the way that they've positioned this new delivery kind of service that they're offering. So it becomes a much more congested space, and thinking about direct sales, it just, kind of clutters the landscape, but it becomes more important than ever.
Yeah. Like other than getting online and like e-com, like have there been any like key things that large corporations have done that you've seen as a direct correlation to kind of an increase in sales? Like have there been any things from like a large macro that maybe entrepreneurs could implement? Like, one of them being the other day you were chatting about like NPS, for example. Are there any tactics or any things that are being implemented from a large corporation standpoint that maybe entrepreneurs, if they were to actually implement, it might be a branding thing, or it might be like an internal cultural thing. Is there anything that you're seeing happening at a macro from a brand perspective that maybe entrepreneurs you think could really implement in their business and see over maybe a long-term direct correlation to growth inside the business?
The one piece that I don't think anybody has control over is being in the right category right now, because certain ones are, of course, just going to be taking a hit. Other ones are going to be built for better success in this situation. Beyond that, actually, entrepreneurs and startups in general, these smaller, nimbler companies are actually better positioned to reflect that agility and really having a close read on what's going on in the market and for their consumers and with their needs to be able to change, whether that means a new version of a product or a new product altogether. That's definitely innate to startups, and it's part of the value prop and really the ethos of even the founder mentality. So leaning into that when bigger companies are having to do that to survive, but it's really in the DNA of startups, is definitely going to be an advantage. And then beyond that, to your point around metrics and how you think about success, this idea of retention is really important. We talked about this changing dynamics around discovery. And if you have all these new consumers trying new brands for whatever reason, this is your moment to hook them and to retain them. And big brands may have either the tracking or the metrics or the data infrastructure or whatever to make that a little bit easier. But it becomes about execution and how you think about retaining them and actually do it. That will actually differentiate the cream of the crop on this front. It's not necessarily the big guys' game to win. So tracking those metrics and thinking about how do you retain your consumers by maintaining a pulse on what they care about and what will keep them coming back to you will be key.
That's huge.
Yeah, that's
awesome.
That's great input. Victoria, we often tell our clients there's like a science and art to content creation, and that you really need to let the data inform what you put out there to reach new clients. And some of them sort of get stifled by that. They're like, well, that's going to inhibit my creativity and this and that. And how do you get brands you work with to buy into the fact that data is your everything and it really does inform your design team and what you are going to put out there? Or by the time they come to you, they already understand the value of that?
Thankfully, the latter point there is definitely the case in a lot of cases for us, where there is a strong appreciation, and Morning Consult's speed and real accessibility of data makes it much less of an uphill battle to convince anyone who might be skeptical. But for us, it comes back down to what are your business goals, which is probably at some point along that conversation going to be to make money. And how do we connect our data, the different metrics we're tracking back to your business performance by way of brand, by way of whatever, KPIs you're finding important. So it ultimately comes back to, what are the needs that we're rooted in are top of mind for our clients, but how does that tie into the KPIs that matter to them, and how does that then translate to business performance?
Mm-hmm. Victoria, talk to me about TikTok culture and your perspective on that, your lens on it. I'm completely bullish on it, and our agency, and I feel like it's the most creative, positive platform right now. I don't feel like a lot of negativity has spread in there yet. As of for me, it's TikTok and Instagram, the most positive platforms. How do you see brands playing into that more and more aggressively in the next few years? Is that an emerging platform in your estimation?
TikTok really hit all of the nerves that needed to be hit for it to be successful this year. Quick, digestible content, but mostly that was pretty light and entertaining and even inspirational. It gave people an outlet for figuring out dances or challenges or whatever the case was. So in that context, I agree with you. I think it's here to stay. I think the power of the Gen Z generation, as well as millennials, and even, I'm sure elder generations will eventually, weasel their way onto it and find the appeal, something they want to stick with. But, the opportunity for brands, it goes back to what we were saying before around, it's about authentic integration into your consumers' lives versus just jumping onto the latest platform that you see all of these, up and coming consumers wanting to, be relevant with. So we've seen some great examples of this already with brands doing challenges, with brands being creative and, striking the right tone and the right style with the advertising that they are putting on the platform. But yes, in short, I think it's the right kind of format of a platform for the audience that it's resonating with. It becomes the challenge for brands to fit into it in a way that's intuitive and not make it feel like, who are these guys and who invited them to this party?
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious to gather some of your insight, Victoria, on ideal audiences. We talk a lot with our clients around, and entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast around really trying to identify your ideal avatar or your ideal niche within a market to speak to them on a granular level through good copywriting, through good messaging, through good targeting. I'm curious to know when somebody works with Morning Consult, what does that process look like? Maybe you can kind of give us I guess a high level overview on what data can really do for an entrepreneur, for a business, for a corporation to have that information to actually physically, and then what are the next steps in regards to marketing? Is it PR? How do you work with them in order to look at this data of this ideal audience and then actually make sure that they're getting the messaging out in front of the right audience to get them ultimately to continue to build brand? Maybe you can kind of give us a high level overview on that.
One of the, I guess, helpful anecdotes I'll share as preface to this here is our most recent Most Loved Brands report this year took a close look at what is driving brand love for consumers of any generation, et cetera. And Neil, you kind of alluded to this before, but one of the table stakes was obviously you have to be aware of a brand in order to feel any sort of affinity towards it, let alone love. So this actually ties into that earlier conversation around performance versus brand marketing. So when you think about, first and foremost, you especially entrepreneurs, there's a balance between going too close in and picking a psychographic or a segment of an audience that you want to just nail successfully and win with versus that kind of broad awareness. And that's something we've seen for better or for worse among a lot of D2Cs. They're just trying to acquire as many consumers as they can as possible. And then the next step becomes double clicking into the ones that are going to stay with you. And this goes back to that loyalty, that retention point. So when we think about how do you, really measure your success and how do you stay with the customers that really are most relevant to you, it then becomes, there's of course, the demographic view. And that's something that we have a lot of depth on with our brand tracking. So that could be as simple as just gender or generation or income levels. But then, we can start to ease into the psychographic side of things. So what type of entertainment do they prefer, or, how do they spend their time? So there's this, very kind of traditional demographic view. There's the behaviors and the media that they consume that layers on to how do you actually reach the right audience. But then there's the psychographic element, which is how do you actually resonate with them? Is it through a focus on sustainability? Is it on being new and innovative? Is it about being prestigious and exclusive? So this trifecta, but knowing that you have to have a strong foundation of just awareness in the first place, is kind of how we think about it.
Yeah, a big part of branding now is having empathy, right? And gratitude and being genuine. It's more important than ever. And when we talk about sort of brand stickiness, we talk about trust, impact, loyalty. And now more than ever, we talk about availability in many cases. So like the run on toilet paper. So that plays into brand reputation now, which toilet paper company can put out the most rolls. But talk about that right now, because it is pretty fascinating, the pandemic. It is almost like, a wartime. We've never lived through a war, but we know sort of what it's like from reading history books around scarcity. What does availability look like now, Victoria, in your mind, to brand reputation and integrity?
The good thing for brands to know is that consumers get it. Like, they don't know the semantics of your supply chain, but they get that everybody is scrambling for things. And the reflection on the brand is less about, they don't care about me and they're not stocking the toilet paper. Okay. It's that I need to be more strategic and potentially not shop at this store and find a new option. But the availability component is only a risk for brands insofar as consumers will switch away from either a given brand or a given retailer in finding alternatives. Thankfully, consumers get it. They also get that marketing is about selling things to them, but they also, understand that supply chain issues and the situation that we're in, there's companies who are able to creatively, switch to producing hand sanitizer, but there's also companies that are not able to suddenly produce the toilet paper or the Clorox wipes that much faster. And it's not necessarily cascading into negative sentiment or kind of horrible reputational damage.
Maybe it's too early to know this, but like, have there been anything, like when we're talking about availability and supply chain, like is there a way to know, like, essentially if another essentially company creates a product where you have this like this iconic brand there for years, it's like what, like, I guess, like, do you have any insight on what goes into another brand coming in, having the availability, and then, creating brand on top of that? Like, what goes into, I guess, like another, like a shift, an entire shift to knock one brand out of the game? We look at it, like, for me, I look at a company like Sears, for example. For us in Canada, they went out of business. Really iconic brand. Like, what goes into consumer shifts? Does it start with availability, or in your mind, what does it start with that essentially creates the downward spiral? And I don't need any specific examples, but like, is there a specific way that consumers are looking at these things, or do you guys have any data around that?
This goes back to the generational point, actually, where we saw that boomers on one end of the spectrum really lean into a brand having been around for a long time is the reason that they love it and they use it. Gen Z is literally not on the radar. There is no statistical relationship with, choice and love. So, part of the answer to your question is twofold, in that increasingly this will become less important that a brand has been around for a long time, but it's kind of the inverse of that is the relevance of a brand to you. So if it's been around for 100 years and mom recommended it, well, suddenly it's more relevant to you, and it's, it's going to play into your choices. If it's been around for 100 years and it's just got, launched this awesome campaign, you have, potentially McDonald's could have been less relevant to younger generations. And in fact, that was part of the reason behind their recent partnerships with J Balvin announced, today, and that's huge for younger generations. So it's less about them thinking, well, this is an old brand that's been around forever and I don't want to use it. It's about how is it staying relevant and playing into my needs or my life or my entertainment or some capacity. That's the kind of dynamic that'll be interesting to watch.
That's a great point. Like I think about, McDonald's, the Travis Scott meal right now on TikTok is blowing up. So it's really cool that you brought that kind of full circle and full around about the relevancy. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and as a Gen Xer, I can kind of defer to my parents, the boomers, or Gen Z, my daughters right now. So I'm kind of on the fence, which is the Canadian way in terms of how I'm going to be impacted by brands. But Victoria, to finish up here, sort of what's been the biggest surprise or revelation for you this year in this historical moment that so many books and movies and documentaries and TV shows are going to come out of from a personal standpoint? And then was there anything that shocked you that came out of like obviously nesting became huge, and home improvement and renovation and being in the home and making it comfortable as possible and getting dogs and pets. But was there any big surprise to you this year in terms of trends that happened out of this whole weird, surreal moment in history?
Sure. For both of your questions there, I think the biggest thing that I'm very interested to see is to what extent will the habits and the hobbies that people have adopted last? So will that be, everyone eventually will be quick to return to restaurants once they're comfortable. Although, of course, we know that there's different profiles of people some are very eager to get back and get on with it, and others are very cautious, and it can take a long time for them to feel comfortable taking their mask off, let alone being in a public place. So, as much as we can track that on a weekly basis, only time will tell what those different profiles look like. But then which of these elements, and I think about that for myself too, I cannot wait to get back to an office, maybe not with a mask on 24/7, but at the same time, I've had to adjust, my workouts, or, I've gotten to spend a lot more time with my family, and you get forced into these situations where you recalibrate priorities. And I think that has big implications as, not only as an individual, but also as a consumer base, and what that means for how you'll shop, how you'll act, how you'll spend your time as well.
Victoria, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your insight. I really thank you for your time. I feel like our audience is getting a ton of value out of this episode. So really appreciate it. If somebody want to reach out to you, they want to learn a little bit more about what you guys do, where's the best place to send them? Where's the best place to reach out to you directly?
Sure, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. So either of those places, just find my name, and you'll see most of my content is right now on LinkedIn, but Morning Consult and I are both very active on Twitter as well. So I'm looking forward to answering any questions or continuing the conversation from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for tuning into another episode of the Studio PTBO podcast. We will see you soon.